Well, I'm breaking away from the way the textbook goes because I want to continue with the use of architecture as propaganda. What do I mean by propaganda? Well, giving a political message of some kind or another. The Forum of Augustus is a political message. It's a beautiful building, or was a beautiful building, but it's also a political message. By completing the buildings that Julius Caesar had begun, but had not completed, Augustus has given you a political message. And we see this political message, this use of architecture as propaganda, perhaps most clearly in this structure here, the Ara Passus Augusti, the altar of the Augustan peace. This is a monument that was built in the Campus Martius up here, right on the main road going into Rome from the north. The Campus Martius, a big area of open parkland, used for getting the soldiers together for a military triumph and parade and things like that, but generally a parkland area. The Ara Pacis looks over the Campus Martius. At some point in its history, we know it was began on it in 13 BC. We know it was dedicated in 9 BC. And at some point in its history, though, it was smashed into pieces and buried. The pieces were rediscovered during an excavation in 1933, I think it was, and Mussolini then decided to actually excavate this altar. He recognized it for what it was and rebuild it. This was a very, very difficult excavation because the Campus Martius is full of very wet soil, soft soil, and it's covered with Renaissance buildings. So they actually had to develop a method of freezing the ground beneath the buildings before they could excavate the altar. But they're able to eventually do that. It was rebuilt next door to the Mausoleum of Augustus, which is where it still is. The altar of the Augustan peace is built entirely of lunar marble. This is not concrete with lunar on the front. It consists essentially of a rectangular enclosure wall with an altar in the center, steps going up to the altar proper on either side. The enclosure wall is about 7 meters high. We don't actually have precise evidence for how high it was. And as you can see, it's just over 10.7 meters long and about 11.6 meters wide. All of this made of lunar marble. Well, the altar was voted by the Senate to celebrate Augustus's victories in North Spain. These victories technically brought peace to the whole of the Roman Empire. The last major war that Augustus officially was to fight. He did go on to fight some more, and it does celebrate the peace of Augustus. As I said, work began 13 BC. It was dedicated in 9 BC. In Roman tradition, an altar always had to be in the open air. So the altar is designed like this. It's within a box-type structure, but without a roof, with an entrance on one side leading up to the altar, then looking through the doorway on the other side there. The exterior of the altar is decorated with a whole series of carvings, not all of them complete, so we can't quite work out what some of them are. You have 2 registers, 2 areas of carving, this lower register here, the upper register there. The interior of the enclosure wall is carved to make it look as if the altar is within the countryside. So you have a representation of what would have been a wooden fence, standing to just over 1 meter high, with a series of wooden posts going higher up, supporting a railing, basically. To convey the impression, to make the point that this is a sacred area, a holy area, the carvings on the interior of the Ara Pacis are specifically meant to have religious symbolism. So, for example, we see these half bull's heads here, a bucrania. Bull's heads are a symbol of sacrifice. You've got the bull's head there, another bull's head here, another bull's head here, or bull's skull rather. In between the bucrania, you have this, it's a garland. The garland is very neatly carved with a series of flowers and fruits representing all 4 seasons of the year, a very important point. And then floating up in the air above, you have this, a patera, singular pateri, plural. This was the dish, rather like the type of dish you find in a Turkish bath for pouring water over your body. It's got a hollow bump in the centre. It's the same type of thing. This was used for pouring wine over the altar during the sacrificial ceremony. Well, there's some argument exactly about the symbolism of all this here. Most people believe that in this specific case, the idea of showing the fruits, the flowers of the plants of all 4 seasons was to convey the idea that, thanks to Augustus, there is peace throughout the year. Well, this presents a little bit of a problem in interpretation, because we can look at the same, and we do see the same motif used in Hellenistic art and Roman art. The Caffarelli sarcophagus is mentioned in the textbook, and I couldn't find a photograph of it, but I did find a photograph of this for you. This is an ossuary, a bone container for a cremation found at Perugia. The same type of general scene here. But on the Caffarelli sarcophagus, on the Perugia's ossuary, in Hellenistic art in general, these scenes associated with the sacrifice, you've got the bucrania there, you've got the patera, you've got the garland. These symbolize everlasting life, life after death. So there is a bit of uncertainty as to exactly what the carvings on the interior of the Aura Pacis symbolize. It's a bit more obvious what the carvings on the exterior do symbolize, however. As I mentioned, in 2 registers. The bottom register is basically the same all the way round. It's a very elaborate motif. It's a scroll type design. You have here this plant with very spiky leaves. This is the acanthus plant. And then you've got all these long spiky bits going out like these. The correct name for these is tendrils. And these are carved to represent vine leaves, vine flowers. Well, in classical art, the vine scroll is a symbol of everlasting life, fertility, prosperity, and things like that. In classical art, the acanthus features in the Corinthian column. It symbolizes sort of life after death to a certain extent in some cases. The Aura Pacis Augusta is the only place, or the earliest place, where we have the acanthus leaf and the vine scroll combined. So exactly what the message is isn't quite certain again. But the overall message of the vine scroll is fertility, prosperity, a peaceful time. What's really fascinating, though, about this lower register is that you get a whole series of little carvings of birds and animals and frogs in here. But the most frequently found bird or animal is this one here. Now this does pretty certainly have a propaganda message behind it. It represents a swan with its very long neck, its wings outstretched like that. The swan is the bird associated with the god Apollo. Roman tradition said that one day Apollo would come back to the world in human form, and this would mark the beginning of a golden age of peace and prosperity and security. All Romans would be familiar with that particular symbolism involved with the swan design there. But Romans would also be familiar with the fact that Augustus prayed to the god Apollo for victory before the Battle of Actium. So he won the Battle of Actium with the help of Apollo. So what we have expressed in this swan motif here is how Apollo has supported Octavian as he was, or Augustus as he becomes, at the Battle of Actium. And by implication, the next message that comes on from that is, of course, that Augustus is Apollo reborn, bringing back a golden age of peace and prosperity. So that's what seems to be implied, or is pretty certainly implied, by the lower register on the Ara Pacis Augusti. The upper register contains figured scenes. Now, on the short ends, you've only got two scenes, one on either side of the doorway. The one on the, which side is it? He has to double check which side it is now. On the east side, there was a figure of Roma, which is very badly, can't even be certain it's Roma, but there's only one small part surviving of that. But the figured panel on the other side quite clearly represents this lady sitting here quite contentedly. She's got her cloak partly over her head. She's got two little boys sitting on her lap. There's a cornucopia here. Cornucopia is cornucopia. The horn of plenty. It's very much a sign of fertility and prosperity. So you've got the cornucopia here with fruits coming out of it. At her feet there's a sheep, rather badly done, and a cow sort of sitting there quite contentedly, chewing the cud as it were. And on either side of her, these two rather strange personifications. By personification, something, a figure that symbolizes a deity, a spirit or something like that. They're both female, they both have their cloaks blowing over their head, which in classical art is a sign of a period of peace. The one over here symbolizes water. You've got a sea dragon coming down by the side here. The one over here is on a swan. She's flying on a swan. She symbolizes, again makes reference to this point about Apollo being the supporter of Augustus. Augustus is, if you like, the new Apollo. The identity of this figure is something that nobody can agree on. Is it Tellus, Mother Earth? Is it Fortuna, a good future? Is it Pax, peace? Well, she could be everybody, but she's more likely, one would think, to be a symbol of Pax. The altar is to peace, so therefore it makes much more sense to have a figure of peace there. But there is still a lot of argument as to exactly who she is meant to represent. On one thing, though, there is no doubt, and that is that the figure of Pax, if that's who it is clearly based on Greek prototypes. The textbook gives you a detailed photograph of this one, the Hagesso relief from Greece, which dates, I think, to the 4th century or so. And you see the woman sitting in exactly the same type of pose, but there's a bit more movement shown with regard to Pax. The same basic type of clothing, the way the drapery goes like that. So you can see the inspiration for this Pax figure comes from Greek art. And don't forget, of course, that we're talking about a time when Roman sculptors don't really exist. Roman stone carvers who can make statues. Romans don't have access to good stone, so they've got nothing really to practice on except imported marble. There has been a lot of argument as to whether or not the altar of the Augustan peace was actually made by Greek sculptors and artists. And somebody has done some pretty detailed analysis of the remains, and you can see there is a difference in quality of the carving in parts of it, which could indicate that yes, Greek artists were involved in making this. The two reliefs on the other doorway, the west doorway, again, the one on the one side is very fragmented, we can't really work it out. And the one on the other side, yes, we're back into this problem of precise interpretation. Whether we think of the lady as Pax, Tellus, or whatever, Fortuna, what we certainly have there is a Greek idea of allegory. The idea of referring to something by something else. It's a clear reference to peace using a mythological or godlike figure. The reliefs on the other side, on the east side, as I said, the one very badly broken, but we do have this one which is substantially more complete. These seem to show scenes from Roman mythology, but of course to the Romans, mythology is not mythology, it's history. So it fits into this Roman concept of art as a historical record. Again, there's a lot of argument as to exactly what this scene represents. You can see there's an older man there with a beard, a Greek-type beard. He's got his cloak pulled slightly over his head. He is velatus. Velatus means covered with a veil. So he is velatus, which is what a Roman male had to do when he was making a sacrifice. Who is he? Some people think it might be a reference to one of the early kings of Rome, but the general agreement is that this actually most likely represents Aeneas. And the clue to the identification of this scene is this little animal here. I'll come back to it in a moment. Well, what you have is this person sacrificing, he's holding his hand out, we're missing the important part of the patera, but we can see a very rough stone-built altar here. There's another figure standing behind him. You can just see the edge of a very broad-brimmed hat, a Macedonian, Thracian type hat. There are two young boys over here. These two boys are bringing cakes for the sacrifice and wine for the sacrifice. And here we have a female pig, a sow. You can tell she's a female pig because she's got udders. There's no doubt about the identification of this. Well, this cannot be a pig that's being taken for a sacrifice because you always use a male pig. This is what gives it a clue to how to best to identify the scene. Roman tradition claims that Venus is the mother of Aeneas, told him in a dream that one day after leaving Troy, he would find the place where he could settle down and start a family and live happily ever after. He would recognize this place when he saw a sow with 30 piglets underneath an oak tree. This is what he sees. He decides to create a new city there, which he calls Lavinium, after his wife, Lavina, daughter of the king of Latium. So this is the Lavinium sow. This refers to this episode in the tradition of Aeneas. Now the sacrifice that he's making are for these little gods up here, sitting in their own little home. These are the Penates. The Penates are the gods of the household. And what does Aeneas take with him from Troy? No, he doesn't take the sacred sword of Troy. He takes the Penates, the household gods of Troy. So we can see in here a reference to a historical episode in Roman history. But we can also look at this scene as if it was a Greek type scene, allegorical. it's referring to something else at the same time. Well, what could that be? Aeneas has a son, Julius Ascanius. The figure behind Aeneas is a young man with a broad-brimmed hat, a Thracian, Trojan-type, Macedonian-type hat. So presumably this represents Julius Ascanius. Julius Ascanius, the ancestor of the Julian family. Augustus is a member of the Julian family. So you can see this is making the point, reminding people of Augustus's origins, ultimately going back to Venus. But you can also see it on a more obvious level, and that at the time the altar was made, Augustus has a stepson, Tiberius, and he has two grandchildren, Lucius and Gaius. So you can see it might also be referring to this, a deliberate reminder to the Roman people of the importance of Augustus in bringing peace and security to Rome, refounding Rome in a sense. When we look at the scenes on the upper registers on the north and south sides, these are something completely different. Now again, they're not perfectly preserved. There's been an awful lot of restoration as well, but you can see the north side pretty well preserved. We're just missing large chunks there. It shows a procession of figures moving from the east to the west. This is a drawing. It shows it in a bit more detail. You can see all these figures all rather crowded together like that. There you've got this wonderful vine scroll with all the swan motifs, swans all over there. And what this scene shows fairly clearly are representations of senators and consuls, people of importance, magistrates in the Roman government. Some are wearing an oak wreath, which symbolises their status. This one is obviously ready for a sacrifice. He is velatus. He has his cloak partly pulled up over his head. Interestingly, it's not just the senators and the consuls, because we also see women in this scene as well, and children as well. When we look at the view on the south side, unfortunately we really are missing the crucial part, all this large chunk here. We've only got the one half that survives. But what we have here is, again, a procession scene. People moving in exactly the same direction. So they're moving from the east towards the west of the altar. Again, you can see it's packed with carvings of people. And this particular scene contains a large number of young children, 3 young children in particular, and at least one figure who's velatus, ready to make a sacrifice, and again, large numbers of females. Now, there's a lot of argument as to who these figures represent. But this guy here, carrying that staff of office there, and there's another 2 or 3 in front, these are clearly lictors. The lictors are the guys who guard the princeps. So this scene had to have had Augustus at the front of it. That then allows us to start making possible interpretations as to who the other figures are. This is commonly believed to be Agrippa. That's commonly believed to be Tiberius, Augustus' son, a stepson. This may be Livia. Well, that's possible. There are 3 young children in the procession, so we can say that 2 of them are probably Augustus' grandsons, but we don't know who the 3rd one is. There's only one slight problem with this interpretation. The altar is dedicated in 9 BC. Some people think this represents the dedication ceremony. Agrippa was dead before 9 BC. So it does create a bit of a problem of interpretation there. But otherwise, as the textbook stresses, what these 2 panels seem to symbolise, yet another propaganda statement, is how Augustus is working with the Senate in this new form of government, the Principate. They work together, they go together in the same direction on the procession, on this piece of carving. But on the imperial family side, if you like, Augustus is also making the point that he sees the Principate as a hereditary system. That once I am dead, there will be others to take over from me. My grandsons, my stepson, 2 stepsons in fact. So there may be some truth in that. It's very difficult to be quite precise. What is very fascinating about the relief, though, is the way it does break away from the existing tradition of Roman and Greek relief carving. Let's go back to the Paris relief, and what we find in the Paris relief is basically people are widely spaced, more or less all the same height, unless they're obviously children. The ultimate inspiration, of course, for all friezes like this goes back to Greece and the Parthenon frieze. But, you know, again, widely spaced, heads more or less the same height. No real sense of movement in any of these earlier works. But whoever carved the Aura Pacis Augusta did a brilliant job in crowding everybody together in such a way that you get the entire space is filled, you've got a sense of movement coming out of this. I mean, look, people turning around, people looking out. It's much more realistic in that particular sense. It's full of movement. It's not static. It's not just a simple straight piece of carving with no movement, which is what you see in the Paris relief, what you see in the Parthenon frieze and so forth. So it does mark an important step forward in that particular way, in including the, this sense of movement. There's also the point, though, very different from Greek architecture and Greek art, the inclusion of all the children in there. You do see children occasionally in other reliefs, but the great thing about the inclusion of the children in this particular relief compared to earlier work is it gives you a more fluid sense. You know, you're not looking at a row of people all the same height, walking all the same way. It's not Egyptian, is it? Or anything like that. Very boring. It's got, by having those children in it, it adds that sense of humanity, but also makes it look more appealing in an artistic sense. Well, the textbook does make the point, and this is a very true point, that these reliefs and the inclusion of the children might also be part of Augustus's political message to the Roman people. Augustus was very conscious of the need for more Roman citizens. Why? Only Roman citizens could fight in the Roman legions. Well, to get Roman citizens, you need peace and security. Families don't produce children if they don't have peace and security. So he brings in a law which some of you might find remarkably familiar. You know, have 3 children. Go out and have 3 children. Well, it didn't matter if they were boys or girls in this particular case, but he preferred boys. And there were great advantages, if you were a Roman citizen, in having 3 children. Your taxes went down. If you wanted to become a politician, you qualified for office at a younger age. To be, for example, a consul, you would normally have to be at least 43 or 45 years old. 3 children, you qualified at the age of 40. You know, I mean, all sorts of advantages there. You want to be a general, have 3 children, you can be a general before you're 38. You know, it's amazing sort of advantages like that. And of course, along with this law promoting familyhood, is another series of laws that punish people if you don't have lots of children, or if you have no children at all. So it is possible, it's also possible, and you know, I'm not an art critic or anything like that, so I'm always slightly dubious about this, but it is possible that this is also meant to give a similar message in that particular way. Go forth and multiply, have lots of children and babies. Rome will be perfectly wonderful if you go out and do all this. So the Arapakis is a wonderful work of art. It's a wonderful piece of propaganda. You can read it on many different levels. Its importance in development of Roman relief carving, and I haven't talked about the Basilica Aemilia reliefs, which is pretty much traditional Roman. But it does fit in with this overall program that we see in the reign of Augustus, of using architecture and art as a political medium, as a way of getting out propaganda. We see this very clearly, for example, in this statue, the Prima Porta statue of Augustus. Prima Porta was the name of the villa where it was found. That villa belonged to Livia, Augustus's second wife. So we always refer to it as the Prima Porta statue. The villa just to the north of Rome, nothing to see there now except for a railway station, quite honestly. The Prima Porta statue is pretty nice to look at. It's slightly more than life size. It shows Augustus as a Roman general, very clear Augustan features. He's got one arm outstretched like that. He was originally holding something in that arm, probably a baton. A baton, a symbol of office, a symbol of being a general, something like that. His finger's slightly outstretched though, the right arm is raised. So generally we would call this the adlocutio position. The audience or the address position. I am addressing an audience position. He's dressed as a Roman general. You can see he has a breastplate on, or cuirass, and he's got a general's cloak, which would have been tied to the shoulders there, comes round the back, and goes over his arm like that. The statue itself presents some problems in interpretation. To begin with, he's shown barefooted. This would tend to imply that the statue was made after he was dead, but I'll come back to that point. The scenes on the breastplate, though, which I'll come back to, can be specifically dated, that central scene, to 20 BC. Is this the face of a 40-year-old man? No. This is the face of an idealized man. The Prima Porta statue goes away from verism, and we see this more and more as we go along with sculpture of the period. Well, I mentioned the bare feet, because the bare feet in a statue of a living person would imply, rather, a real person would imply that that person is dead. But bare feet is also a symbol of a deity, of being godlike. Now remember Augustus' background. He's a member of the Julian family. The Julian family on the one side is from Aeneas, the son of Venus. On the other side, it's from Romulus, the son of Mars. These things all tie up quite neatly in many ways there. As for Augustus himself, after Julius Caesar was murdered, Caesar was declared a divus, godlike. He was thought to be with the gods. So in a sense, Augustus could be seen as the son of an almost god. So the bare feet might be meant to indicate this particular point. We can't be certain. The Cupid on the dolphin, though, must certainly be a reference to this being a descendant of Aeneas, whose mother was Venus. Venus, and I thought I'd put on a little bit of semi-porn from the 19th century. Venus was born, yes, see, everybody suddenly wakes up, see? I told you a lunchtime class would be worth it. Sorry, ladies. Whoops, I'm going to get hit afterwards, I know, by some people. Venus is born fully formed, of course, from the waves. Here you've got a Triton, you've got a Nereid there, look, there's another Triton down here. And she's always shown with Cupids. Cupids are her little helpers, and this is exactly what we have here. Cupid on a dolphin. So this is probably a reference to Venus, an indirect reference to Augustus being related to the gods. But the real thing that we need to look at is this, the cuirass. Cuirass or breastplate. The central scene shows you a man in Eastern clothing, baggy trousers, baggy tunic, long hair, long beard, facing a Roman soldier. This man is holding a Roman legionary standard, the emblem of a legion. We know that in the year 20 BC, Augustus' stepson Tiberius went to the east and received from the Parthians the legionary standards they had captured at the Battle of Carrhae, when Crassus was killed, 53-54 BC. So this is a specific historical reference to a specific event. It makes the point. Remember the Temple of Mars altar? Mars will avenge, I, Augustus, through Mars, will avenge any defeats suffered by the Roman people. On top of the epaulets, these parts here, now the textbook's wrong, these are actually sphinxes, and these sphinxes represent the fact that Augustus captured Egypt, made Egypt a safe, secure part of the Roman Empire. Egypt is the main supplier of food, wheat, to Rome. So there's a little reference there to Augustus' victories. But the rest of all this is all tied up with peace, prosperity. So we've got the sky god up here, holding up the skies, with Helios, the sun god, racing in his chariot across the front. Luna, the moon goddess, is just escaping over there. And this lady here, who's actually holding a jug, she symbolizes the dawn, the beginning of the day. The jug represents the morning dew, early in the morning. You don't get it so much in Turkey, but it's a very common natural phenomenon in other parts of Europe. Early in the morning, when the sun's just rising, been a bit of a cold night, and you see little drops of water all over the grass. It's morning dew. Well, that's who this is. She's sprinkling the morning dew, because the sun is rising as night goes away. So it's symbolizing the beginning of a new day, a new period. Down here, we've got two females not looking terribly happy. These symbolize conquered areas. Augustus has defeated enemies of Rome. But then we come down here, we've got a griffin on one side, and on the griffin there's Apollo playing sitar. Over here we have a deer, and on the deer is who goes with Apollo. I can never remember who goes with Apollo, but that one will come to me. Come on, quick, quick. Who goes with Apollo? Oh, la, 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 la. I'm going to have to look at this now. Come on, Diana. Come on, you knew that all the time, didn't you? Now, the griffin symbolizes the east, so does Apollo. Diana and the deer symbolize the west, so it gives this message of Augustus ruling the west and the east. And then at the bottom, you've got Mother Earth, or Fortuna, again with the cornucopia. So again, it's symbolizing a time of peace and prosperity. How are we doing for time? Great, that means I can finish off prima porta quite happily. The textbook does make the point that originally this statue, like all statues, was painted. And enough remains of the actual paint on the statue, which is on display in the Vatican Museum, to reconstruct the overall scheme. Now, we can't be certain about that. That's probably unlikely. But Augustus is wearing a very brightly painted red or scarlet cloak. His tunic is white. His breastplate is a golden bronze colour. You can see the Parthian in his very bright colours there. You can see the blue of the sky, the gold of Helios coming over there. The darkness of night, not terribly clearly represented there. So this really is, would have been a very dramatic piece of work. But remember, this is a marble copy, probably, of a bronze original. We tend to forget, in fact, we forget most of the time, that bronze statues were much more common in the ancient world than stone ones. But bronze could be melted down and made into something else very easily. So bronze statues, very few survive. Stone ones, well, they've usually got their nose broken from when they've fallen over. But the stone ones, unless they've been burnt for lime, there's not a lot you can do with a piece of sculptured stone, so they do tend to survive much better. Well, the inspiration for this particular statue is, of course, the Doryphorus statue, a statue made in the 5th century by Polyclitus. Is it Polyclitus? Yeah. Come on, you're all supposed to know this. Is not my period. Polyclitus, a very famous piece of statue, the Doryphorus, the spear carrier. The Doryphorus, the original, doesn't survive, but we do have any number of copies of this. So you can see you standing there looking like a young athlete, idealized, lovely muscular body, that type of thing. This, by the way, is what we call a strut. Artists weren't always certain about how strong the marble would be, so rather than risk having the arm fall off after carving it, you left a strut in. This is also a strut to support the leg, because otherwise the statue might fall over at the knee. But you can see it's a very common type. This is the front and back view of one particular version. This is another copy. We've got so many copies of this. This one, I think, came from Aphrodisias, but the copies found all over the Roman world. Well, it's this type of Greek art which is the Prima Porta statue is based on. You've got the same basic leg stance, the sort of left knee forward, the right the right leg forward, the left knee bent slightly. Obvious differences, of course, the statue of Augustus ad locutio, the Doryphorus with his arm down the side there. The position of the hand on the Augustus is slightly different, but it's the same general thing. But it's this overalized, sort of idealized portrait that we have here. Augustus must have been at least 40 when that statue was made. So it's a very idealized portrait of Augustus. It brings in the smoothness of the skin, a study of the bone structure of the face, something which is much more Greek than Roman. Roman verism has gone out the window. Now remember what I said, the Romans thought that an interest in the visual arts was very un-Roman. But within this period of about 200 years, you've got a distinct change in attitude. One good thing about Augustus, one way we can always recognize him, is his hairstyle. And you will learn in some of these classes how to identify a Roman emperor by his beard or his hairstyle. In this particular case, you've got these two particular locks of hair that go like that, like on a crab, like a crab claw. So a very characteristic appearance there. This is the Prima Porta statue. This is a bronze head that was found at Arsinoe in Egypt of the younger Octavian. And this is the next one we're going to look at, statue of Augustus, to make this point of this classicizing, if you like, this more idealized representation is coming into fashion. The Via Labicana statue. The Via Labicana is a road leading out of Rome. The statue was found by the road, that's why we call it the Via Labicana statue. Well, here you can see Augustus wearing sandals, so definitely alive, wearing the very heavy toga of a Roman citizen, typical toga of the late 1st century, early BC, early 1st century AD. I know, everybody knows that when we dress up in a toga for a fancy dress party, we go and get a double bread sheet and we wrap it around us, This is made of wool, and it's approximately 4 meters long when rolled out. This is heavy and not easy to wear. You don't fasten it anywhere, so you have to drape it over your arm and tuck a little fold in there. Not a terribly comfortable piece of costume. Well, it shows Augustus Velatus, as you can see here. He's got the head over, he's got his toga pulled up over his head. Notice also that little crack that shows there, because this statue makes a very interesting point. In the Roman world, it was quite common to make a statue of a body. And then somebody would come along and say, oh, I'd like a statue like that. Could you put my head in it, please? So this is why so many classical statues are missing their heads. And this is why we have so many heads from classical statues that don't have bodies with them. Heads were made separately. And if you look here, you can see this point. All of this is carved as a separate piece. It was probably some guy wanted to have a nice statue of Augustus. As a priest, he went along to the local sculptor and said to him, oh, that's the one I want. Could you put me a head of Augustus on it, please? You know, that's the way these things work. But again, we see in this particular one, we can't date it, just generally Augustan. This idealized appearance of Augustus, perpetually youthful. He never gets any older than roughly about 20, 25. And this verism, this idea of verism has gone out of the window. What we're finding is this more idealized portraiture. This is a cameo. A cameo can be a stone, an agate, a stone with 2 different layers of colour in it. You carve the one layer down to reveal the background. A cameo can be made of glass. I don't know what this one is, but you can see white material on the top, black material lower down. It's only about 5 or so centimetre high. Representing Livia, the wife of Augustus. Well, you recognise the hairstyle. It's a basic nodus hairstyle we saw with the Republican lady. The hair is brushed back, but here, very elaborate. It's combed up and plaited. I don't know how long it would take to do that. Anybody want to try? Come on, Handy. You try it over the weekend. You come next week like this. So you've got this sort of portrait of Livia. How realistic it is, we don't know, because the only other portraits we have of Livia are, again, sort of kind of idealized. So we don't really know what it's like. The textbook makes a great play on the interpretation of how this shows you a very strong-willed woman, determined for her son Tiberius to become emperor at some point, etc., etc., etc. Well, I don't go along with that. I think she looks sort of rather nice and eternally young. But again, of course, you know, with this nodus hairstyle, occasionally plaited a little bit back like that. And I think that's where I finish. Okay. So I'll see you all on Monday. It's up here, right on the main road going into Rome from the north. The Campus Martius, a big area of open parkland, used for getting the soldiers together for a military triumph and parade and things like that, but generally a parkland area. The Aurapakis looks over the Campus Martius. At some point in its history, we know it was began on it in 13 BC. We know it was dedicated in 9 BC. And at some point in its history, though, it was smashed into pieces and buried. The pieces were rediscovered during an excavation in 1933, I think it was. And Mussolini then decided to actually excavate this altar. He recognized it for what it was and rebuild it. This was a very, very difficult excavation because the Campus Martius is full of very wet soil, soft soil, and it's covered with Renaissance buildings. So they actually had to develop a method of freezing the ground beneath the buildings before they could excavate the altar. But they're able to eventually do that. It was rebuilt next door to the Mausoleum of Augustus, which is where it still is. The altar of the Augustan piece is built entirely of lunar marble. This is not concrete with lunar on the front. It consists essentially of a rectangular enclosure wall with an altar in the centre, steps going up to the altar proper on either side. The enclosure wall is about 7 meters high. We don't actually have precise evidence for how high it was. And as you can see, it's just over 10.7 meters long and about 11.6 meters wide. All of this made of lunar marble. Well, the altar was voted by the Senate to celebrate Augustus's victories in North Spain. These victories technically brought peace to the whole of the Roman Empire. The last major war that Augustus officially was to fight. He did go on to fight some more, and it does celebrate the peace of Augustus. As I said, work began 13 BC. It was dedicated in 9 BC. In Roman tradition, an altar always had to be in the open air. So the altar is designed like this. It's within a box-type structure, but without a roof, with an entrance on one side leading up to the altar, then looking through the doorway on the other side there. The exterior of the altar is decorated with a whole series of carvings, not all of them complete, so we can't quite work out what some of them are. You have 2 registers, 2 areas of carving, this lower register here, the upper register there. The interior of the enclosure wall is carved to make it look as if the altar is within the countryside. So you have a representation of what would have been a wooden fence, standing to just over 1 meter high, with a series of wooden posts going higher up, supporting a railing, basically. To convey the impression, to make the point that this is a sacred area, a holy area, the carvings on the interior of the Aura Pacis are specifically meant to have religious symbolism. So, for example, we see these half bull's heads here, a bucrania. Bull's heads are a symbol of sacrifice. You've got the bull's head there, another bull's head here, another bull's head here, or bull's skull rather. In between the bucrania, you have this, it's a garland. The garland is very neatly carved with a series of flowers and fruits representing all 4 seasons of the year, a very important point. And then floating up in the air above, you have this, a patera, singular pateri, plural. This was the dish, rather like the type of dish you find in a Turkish bath for pouring water over your. Well, I'm breaking away from the way the textbook goes because I want to continue with the use of architecture as propaganda. What do I mean by propaganda? Well, giving a political message of some kind or another. The Forum of Augustus is a political message. It's a beautiful building, or was a beautiful building, but it's also a political message. By completing the buildings that Julius Caesar had begun, but had not completed, Augustus has given you a political message. And we see this political message, this use of architecture as propaganda, perhaps most clearly in this structure here, the Aura Pacis Augusti, the altar of the Augustan peace. This is a monument that was built in the Campus Martius.